Hi, this is Jacqueline Blaine. I'm an instructor in the English department at City Tech, and I wanted to talk a little bit about an aspect of checking sources for credibility that we don't often think about, and that is more than just the author and the publication itself. There are other things involved with it as well. Um, it's also the kind of article that we find that's a really important thing to think about, and again, it's not something we consider very often. Now, we all usually go to professional journals because they're peer reviewed, they're looked at by people in the profession, and so that the information in there is generally considered credible. But most of us, when we start looking for stuff, we hit Google, and what do we find on Google? Not usually the peer reviewed sources, unless you're looking at Google Scholar. So, how do we judge the things that we find on Google and whether they're credible or not? Well, one first thing you can look at is some of the big things that pop up come from mainline news sources, the press services, the newspapers, the broadcast news sites, and then sites that are associated with specific journals like The Economist or the National Geographic. One thing to think about is a lot of these lean in different directions in terms of political spectrum. So it's often a really good idea to check what that publication is in terms of potential political bias by going to something like allsides.com or finding a media bias chart, which is pretty interesting information. There are also non mainline sources that turn up, like blog posts and YouTube channels. Um, some of these things, like Twitter threads and Instagram stories and YouTube channels, will often be connected to mainline sources. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind. Some are not. And again, you kind of have to start thinking about who the people are that are putting these up there. But in any event, some of the things that we find, whether they are mainline sources or non mainline, they tend to fall into this group: news articles, feature articles, opinion pieces, and letters to the editor. Even if they're on Twitter, you may find a whole bunch of news sources and news stories, news reports that are on a Twitter thread. So, what's the difference between these four kinds of things? Well, they all have their pluses and minuses. Um, they all have credibility situations, things we need to think about. They all have conventions, things we expect from each one of them. So let's take a look at some of these. Let's start with the news report. This is what a journalist would call straight news. It's just the who, what, when, and where of something. So, for example, as I say here, a bill gets passed. A straight news report would say when it was passed, maybe what the voting thing looks like, um, who voted for it and who voted against it, what was in the article, just the straight facts. A protest march is held. Again, a straight news report is just going to say where it was held, who held it, what happened. Just very simple, very straight stuff. So the credibility of news reports is very high because journalists are trained to just get the facts, right, and not to inject their own opinions into this thing. And they're really good for getting the basic facts of a situation. So if you want to get some good background, go to a news source and just look for news reports. And you can tell because there's no I in there, there's no sense that there's an author at all. Here's an example of one from the uh, big winter storm that hit the Northeast. The straight news reports from the Washington Post. It's just got the facts about how many people didn't have power, what the couple government officials said about it, and how much snow there actually was. Okay, so it's just very straightforward. Simple quotes, news report. A feature article is something else again. It's longer, it's more in depth, lots of interviews, lots of facts, often lots of pictures. The writer uh, will occasionally interject him or herself into it, usually by way of analyzing what um, the the thing that's being featured in the article is really talking about, like putting something into historical perspective. So, for example, a bill gets passed. The writer can take a look at who the people were who talked about it. Just do a bunch of interviews on one side or the other. Sometimes the bias will show up, sometimes it won't. Sometimes it's just straightforward observation. Maybe the writer observes what happened, that there a fight broke out in the legislature or whatever. Protest marches held, same thing. A lot of interviews, a lot of really putting you in place, how it happened, what happened, just really much more in depth. If a feature article is under 500 words, which most of them, I mean, if a news report is under 500 words, which most are, the feature article can go a couple thousand words. They're much longer. Um, Credibility for a feature article is really very high. It still focuses on the facts. The writer's very clear. They may have their own opinion that they're saying in here, but they're going to make it very clear that they are, and that it's really connected to what the facts themselves are. It's usually got a lot of in-depth analysis and look at the subject. So it's really good for getting quotes and background material, really going into some of the as we call it, deep dive into information. Here's a feature article. This was from the Times. It's about a dancer, and this author um, really goes to some lengths to put Latasha Barnes into the history of dance, different kinds of dance, and how she does stuff that nobody else is doing. So you get a sense of the author, of the writer in here, but you also get a whole lot of information, and it's really about the subject of the feature article, of this feature. Third one, opinion pieces. This is one person's opinion. Um, Very unapologetic, very strong language. They definitely make an argument. Um, in the mainstream news, a lot of opinion writers have their own byline, which means they've got a regular column. People like Jennifer Rubin from the Washington Post, or Tom Friedman, David Broder from the Times. So if we go back to our bill and our protest march, a bill gets passed. David Broder at the Times really writes about sort of the morality of politics. So he would write his opinion about how the bill helps or hurts our moral stance in the world, or our moral stance as a country. Protest march is held. Jennifer Rubin, generally considered conservative, although not so much lately, she would write about how her conservative colleagues should do more than just react negatively to a Black Lives Matter march, for example. Um, the credibility really depends on the publication. The mainstream news sources, their opinion writers have their own sort of what we call a beat. They have their own topic that they're really sort of an expert on. So if it's something from the Washington Post, you can say that what they're saying is probably credible if you understand what their bias is. Right. So if you know that Jennifer Rubin tends to be conservative, you can take it with a grain of salt. Right. What they're good at is um, adding to a pro con about an argument. You can get two opinion writers, a conservative one and a more liberal one, writing about the same topic, and get two different positions. So this is really good for helping you create an argument if you're doing a researched argument piece. The other thing is that these opinion writers often have an area that they know a lot about. Like Tom Friedman knows a lot about, particularly Middle Eastern situation, because he covered it as a reporter for years, and that's his beat. So, it depends on the publication. If you're getting something from a publication you don't know anything about, you have to be kind of careful about these things. The good news is that opinion writers do put their names on their pieces, so you know who actually is writing it. Here's an opinion piece from the Post. Paul Waldman writes a column for them. This is about um, him talking about the the new position on the Supreme Court that's opening up, and how some people are reacting to President Biden's pledge to nominate a black woman to the court. Um, and he sets up the situation. He talks about a little bit about the history of the Supreme Court, uh, how people are reacting, and then he just goes off and tells people exactly what he thinks about their positions. Right, opinion piece. And finally, a letter to the editor. These are short little pieces, very short usually, 250 words, written by a member of the general public. Usually they get excited or outraged by something that's going on in the world, and so they write a letter to the editor. It often starts with a personal story, and then they go on and argue a point. So they're often parts of an argument. For example, go back to our bill. Somebody gets annoyed about the bill, something in the bill, and they write about how it's going to make their lives miserable or make their lives better. Protest march, same thing. They're going to write about how it affects them. They may start off with a story about their own personal situation, and then say what happened when they went to the march and what they think we should do next as a country. Credibility is fairly low, just because these people are they're just general public. They don't normally cover a beat, although sometimes, as I say at the bottom here, they know a lot about a subject, particularly if they are well versed in the sciences. They may have a lot to give to an argument. But the credibility is low because, again, it's just their opinion. They're not a regular contributor, so we're not really sure who these people are. What they're good for when you're doing research is it could give you access to personal anecdotes, personal stories you could use as examples for your research. Again, making sure to say that this is just comes from somebody, a member of the general public, right? And they can often sometimes point you to get you thinking about other areas of research because they've got their own personal specific look at the situation and at the topic. So it can provide more ideas, right? So here's a letter to the editor. This is from uh, a young person talking about a pass fail policy and how it had a negative impact on where he went to school. Now you can tell it's a letter to the editor, even though the post puts it under opinions, because it's signed at the bottom and the city that this person is from. Right, so they have to be that transparent, saying what their name is and at least the town that they come from. But you can see how short it is. They're all very short. So they're all good choices. They're all good for different things. You have to pay attention to where they come from, um, how credible the source, the publication is, a little bit about the author. But knowing that you're looking at an opinion piece versus a news report will tell you a lot about how much to believe what they've written, how much is the quote unquote truth, if there is such a thing. Right? News reports are just the facts. Everything else is going to have more or less of the author's opinion in there. So you choose wisely. Use of them what you can, what you want to. Um, Use them for finding quotes, for finding facts, but just know what it is you're after. You'll find the same kinds of things on Twitter threads, and Instagram stories, and YouTube channels. So it all kind of feeds together. Um, but beware, this is not professional. This is not peer review. This is a popular press. So choose, enjoy, and be wise about your choices.